Camera flashes strobed against the wrought iron perimeter of the White House North Gate. The November wind carried the low hum of idling limousines and the sharp murmurs of the Washington press corps. I stood in the VIP queue, letting the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown brush against the damp pavement. 2 feet ahead of me, my father, Richard, held his gold-embossed invitation up to the security floodlights like a trophy. He was a Pennsylvania hedge fund manager who had built an empire on leveraged buyouts and sheer intimidation. He adjusted his bespoke tuxedo lapels and turned to me. The flashbulbs caught the cruel twist of his mouth. "You were not invited, Nomi." He kept his voice low enough to evade the directional microphones of nearby journalists. He flicked his wrist, tapping the thick cardstock against his palm. "Call a cab back to whatever pathetic cubicle you crawl out of. Do not embarrass us by loitering at the gate." Beside him, my brother's wife, Jessica, pulled her mink wrap tighter against the evening chill. Her eyes darted over my simple dress. It was a silent, practiced visual appraisal, calculating my net worth and finding it negligible. "Honestly, Richard, why did she even follow us from the hotel?" She sighed, feigning pity. "They do not let mid-level government accountants through the front door." I offered no rebuttal. I did not tighten my jaw or break eye contact. Over the past 34 years, silence had become my most effective armor against their specific brand of poison. The queue advanced. Richard stepped to the mahogany podium, presenting his gilded envelope to the hostess with a predatory smile. "Richard Wallace and family, primary table." The hostess scanned the barcode. "Ah, yes. Welcome, Mr. Wallace. Please proceed through the metal detectors." Richard threw one final dismissive glance over his shoulder at me. "Go home, Nomi," he mouthed the words. He stepped toward the security archway. I moved to the podium, taking his place. The hostess let her smile falter. Her gaze dropped to my empty hands. "I am sorry, ma'am. This entrance requires platinum clearance." I reached into the hidden seam of my clutch and withdrew a matte black unmarked card. No gold foil, no crest, just a cryptographic chip embedded in reinforced polymer. I laid it on the scanner. A sharp, high-pitched tone pierced the ambient noise. The podium interface flashed from a standard green to a harsh, blinking crimson. It was a Level 1 security override. The hostess froze. Her eyes snapped from the screen to my face. Her breath caught audibly in her throat. Her hands trembled as she abandoned the scanner and turned to a 4-star admiral standing near the inner barricade. "Sir," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "She is here." The admiral turned. He bypassed the magnetometers. His polished boots struck the pavement with measured rhythm. The crowd parted instinctively. He stopped exactly 1 pace in front of me and snapped a flawless, rigid salute. "Welcome, Director," he said. His voice carried over the sudden quiet of the checkpoint. "The perimeter is secure." Richard stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained from his face, leaving him a pale, hollowed-out shell. Jessica let her mink wrap slip from her shoulder, trailing on the concrete. A Secret Service detail commander flanked the admiral, pointing a gloved hand toward my family. "Process them through the secondary holding pen," he ordered. Agents moved in, unhooking the velvet ropes and ushering Richard and Jessica into a stark, glass-walled security box reserved for high-risk screenings. They pounded on the reinforced pane. Their mouths moved in panicked, silent protests. I did not spare them a second glance. I adjusted my clutch and walked down the pristine red carpet, leaving them trapped behind the glass. My name is Nomi Wallace. I am 34 years old, and I serve as the director of a special access program within Treasury Intelligence. My family thought I pushed papers at a metal desk. They had no idea I held unilateral authority over the domestic financial security of the United States. Welcome to Pana Vengeance, where ordinary people face the moment that changes everything and choose calculated silence over useless noise. Tell me your age in the comments, and let me know if you have ever sat at a table where your own blood treated you like a footnote. Drop a comment to claim your space, and be sure to subscribe. You are going to want to hear exactly how I dismantled a billion-dollar empire from the inside out. To understand how my family ended up begging behind bulletproof glass, you need to understand what happened exactly 1 week earlier. It was a Tuesday evening at my father's sprawling estate in the wealthy suburbs of Philadelphia. The dining room was suffocating, despite its vaulted ceilings. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh glare over the roasted pheasant and the heavy silver cutlery. It was a dinner meant to celebrate the impending finalization of a historic corporate merger. Richard and my brother Preston were securing an influx of foreign capital that would supposedly elevate their firm into the global stratosphere. I sat near the end of the long mahogany table sipping sparkling water. My mother Vivian sat opposite me, swirling her wine. She examined my plain gray blazer with thinly veiled disdain. "It is a shame you could not find something more festive to wear, Nomi," Vivian said. Her tone was light, but the intent was sharp. "Preston is closing the deal of a lifetime, and you show up looking like you are ready to file tax returns." Preston leaned back in his velvet chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He possessed the kind of effortless corporate charm that easily masked his profound moral bankruptcy. "Leave her alone, Mother," he chuckled. "Civil service does not exactly pay for tailored silk. Besides, we need someone to keep the mundane wheels of bureaucracy turning while the rest of us build the real economy." I set my glass down. The condensation pooled on the polished wood. "I am comfortable, Preston," I said evenly. Preston waved a dismissive hand, taking a long swallow of his aged scotch. "I just wish this administration was as comfortable. We have the foreign investors lined up, but there is an annoying federal compliance glitch holding up the offshore routing numbers. Some faceless bureaucrat flagged the transfer. My legal team will crush them by Friday, but it is a nuisance." I kept my face perfectly neutral. Preston had no idea that the faceless bureaucrat who manually blocked his illicit routing numbers that very morning was sitting 5 feet away from him. Richard cleared his throat, tapping his fork against his plate to command the room. "The nuisance will be handled," he declared. "We have more pressing logistical matters to finalize tonight." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick blue legal folder. The room grew unnervingly quiet as he tossed it across the table. It slid over the smooth mahogany and stopped exactly an inch from my water glass. I looked down at the bold printed letters on the cover. It was a deed relinquishment form. The property in question was a 100-acre farm in rural Pennsylvania. It was the only asset my late grandmother had managed to keep out of Richard's grasping hands. She had left it entirely to me. I remembered her holding my hand in her hospital bed, whispering that it was the only piece of ground my father could not corrupt. "Sign it," Richard said. He did not phrase it as a request. He picked up a gold-plated pen and slid it toward me. "I have a notary waiting in the study. We are transferring the title to the firm tonight." I did not touch the pen. I looked from the blue folder to my father. Why does a hedge fund managing a billion-dollar merger need an old farmhouse? Preston let out an exasperated sigh. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, treating me like a slow child who failed to grasp basic addition. "We need unencumbered real estate, Nomi. Pristine assets with no corporate liens attached. We are securing a temporary international loan to finalize the merger. The foreign partners require clean collateral." The words hung in the air. Clean collateral, foreign partners, temporary loan. My mind automatically filtered their corporate jargon, translating it into the precise legal definitions recognized by the Treasury Department. They were describing textbook money laundering. They were trying to use my inheritance to wash illicit funds from overseas. I pushed the blue folder back toward the center of the table. The friction of the heavy paper against the wood sounded loud in the quiet room. "I am not signing over the farm," I said. The silence that followed was dense and highly combustible. The polite facade of a family dinner evaporated in a split second. Preston slammed his open palms onto the table. The sudden impact rattled the crystal goblets, sending drops of red wine staining the white linen tablecloth. He stood up, looming over the feast, his face twisted into a mask of raw, unfiltered rage. "You arrogant little wretch," Preston shouted. Spit flew from his lips. "You sit at this table eating our food, and you think you have the right to say no? I will destroy you, Nomi. I will unleash a team of corporate litigators that will bury you in so many frivolous lawsuits, you will not be able to afford the bus fare to your sad little desk job. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. I will make 3 phone calls tomorrow morning and have you terminated. I know federal judges. I know senators. You are nothing. You are a rounding error in my life. I sat perfectly still. I did not lean back or flinch away from his pointed finger. I let the threats wash over me, collecting them, classifying them, measuring their weight. I am not signing it, I repeated, my voice never rising above a conversational volume. This was the precise moment they crossed the line from greed into federal extortion. And this was the precise moment I decided to burn their empire to the ground. The dining room descended into a suffocating quiet, broken only by Preston taking a ragged breath. He remained standing with his knuckles pressed white against the polished wood of the table. A single drop of spilled wine dripped from the edge of the linen, landing on the imported rug with a soft, rhythmic tap. I kept my hands resting gently in my lap. I did not match his erratic energy. In my line of work, you learn quickly that whoever loses their temper first has already lost the negotiation. Vivian broke the silence. She did not yell. My mother never yelled. She preferred to deliver her cruelty with the practiced precision of a surgeon. She set her wine glass down and folded her hands, gazing at me with a look of profound, curated exhaustion. You have always been so unnecessarily difficult, Nomi, Vivian murmured. Her tone carried the weight of a long-suffering martyr. Your father and your brother are attempting to secure the legacy of this family, and you sit there acting as if they are asking you to sever a limb. She tilted her head, examining me as if I were a defective product she regretted purchasing. Growing up, Vivian treated her children like investment portfolios. Preston yielded high returns. He played golf with the right executives, married the right socialite, and parroted Richard's talking points flawlessly. I, on the other hand, chose a state university over an Ivy League legacy admission. I chose federal service over corporate rating. In Vivian's eyes, my independence was a personal insult to her parenting. It is a dilapidated farmhouse, Nomi. She continued, her voice smooth and unnervingly calm. It produces nothing. It sits empty 9 months out of the year. Your father is offering to roll its value into a merger that will ensure this family remains untouchable for generations. You should be thanking him for finding a use for it. It was my grandmother's home, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. And the deed is in my name. That makes it my decision. Jessica let out a sharp, grating laugh. She leaned back in her chair, adjusting the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. She was new money, trying desperately to act like old money. Her entire identity hinged on the Wallaces retaining their dominant status in the Pennsylvania social circuit. Listen to her, Preston, Jessica sneered, casting a disdainful look at my sensible leather flats and off-the-rack gray blazer. She thinks a piece of paper gives her leverage. You do not understand how the real world operates, Nomi. You spend your days stamping forms in some depressing government basement. We are talking about global finance. She gestured vaguely toward the blue folder resting on the table. You are holding up a billion-dollar transaction out of pure, petty jealousy. It is pathetic. You resent Preston because he built an empire while you count pennies to pay rent. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to explain you to my friends? I have to pretend your little civil service job is some sort of noble charity work. I let Jessica talk. Her fragile vanity was a thin veil over her deep-seated insecurity. She needed me to be small so she could feel large. I did not interrupt her because every word she spoke was handing me another piece of the puzzle. If this merger is worth $1 billion. I said, shifting my gaze away from Jessica and locking eyes with my brother. Why do you need a rural farm to secure the final phase? Traditional lending institutions do not require unencumbered personal real estate from a CEO to finalize corporate mergers. They leverage the firm's existing assets. Preston scoffed. He sank back into his velvet chair, dragging a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and supreme condescension. "This is exactly why you do not sit at the grown-up table, Nomi," he mocked. "You think global finance works like a neighborhood credit union. We are not dealing with a local bank. We are finalizing a strategic partnership with an overseas holding trust. They operate outside of standard Western banking regulations." I raised an eyebrow, projecting mild curiosity, while my internal threat detection systems flared to life. "Outside standard regulations," I echoed softly. "They require guarantees." Preston pressed on his ego, blinding him to the trap he was walking into. "Corporate assets are subject to public audits and SEC oversight. Our foreign partners demand collateral that cannot be traced back to the firm's primary ledgers. They need an asset that exists entirely off the books to process the facilitation fees. Once the capital injects into our accounts, we pay off the temporary hold, and the farm reverts back to you. It is a seamless ghost transaction." The air in the room felt suddenly heavier. Facilitation fees. Ghost transaction. Preston was using sanitized corporate jargon to describe the movement of dark money. They were not just evading taxes. They were establishing a blind pipeline to wash illicit funds through American soil. My grandmother's farm was intended to be the untraceable washing machine. "And who exactly are these foreign partners?" I asked. My voice remained steady, betraying none of the cold dread settling in my chest. Richard slammed his flat palm onto the table, cutting Preston off before he could answer. The loud crack silenced the room instantly. "That is none of your concern," Richard warned. The veins in his neck stood out in stark relief. His predatory mask had slipped, revealing the desperate, ruthless man underneath. "You do not need to understand the mechanics of the deal. You only need to understand your role in it." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany surface. His eyes bored into mine, dark and unyielding. "I am your father. I clothed you. I put a roof over your head. I paid for that useless state college degree you hold so dear. You have lived your entire life in the shadow of my success, reaping the benefits of my name. It is time you paid your debts." I looked at the man who had spent 3 decades treating me like an inconvenient afterthought. He viewed parenthood not as a relationship, but as a transactional ledger. In his mind, he had purchased my loyalty, and now he was calling in the marker. "I do not owe you a farm to fund a shadow ledger, Richard," I said, utilizing his first name to strip away the paternal illusion. Vivian gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "How dare you speak to him that way?" Richard held up a hand, silencing my mother. He stared at me, his jaw muscles flexing. He realized that intimidation was not breaking my composure. He shifted his tactics, sliding from raw anger into a cold, calculated menace. "You think you have a choice here, Nomi." He spoke in a low rumble that carried more weight than any scream. "You think you can walk into my house, sit at my table, and obstruct my future? Let me make the reality of your situation crystal clear." He tapped the gold pen against the blue folder. "If you do not pick up this pen and sign that deed tonight, I will ensure you have no future left to protect. You think your brother was joking about the litigators. I have a legal team on retainer that specializes in tying up disputed assets for decades. I will lock that farm in probate hell until the property taxes bleed you dry. I will have investigators dig into every facet of your mediocre life. I will ruin your credit. I will make sure you are unemployable in any sector of this country." The threat was methodical and precise. It was the exact strategy he used to crush rival firms and silence whistleblowers. He was treating his own daughter like a hostile corporate takeover. I felt a cold thrill radiate through my veins. They were so blinded by their own hubris, they failed to realize who they were threatening. Richard thought he was intimidating a helpless clerk. He had no idea he was declaring war on a federal intelligence director with the power to freeze his entire portfolio with a single keystroke. I kept my face perfectly still. I let the silence stretch, allowing their threats to echo and settle into the foundation of the room. The trap was laid. I just needed to let them tighten the noose around their own necks. The silence in the dining room hung thick and suffocating, like the calm before a violent storm. Richard sat perfectly still, waiting for his threats to fracture my resolve. He expected tears. He expected a desperate plea for forgiveness. He expected me to reach for the gold-plated pen and surrender my only piece of independence. I did none of those things. I met his cold, calculating gaze and let a fraction of a second pass before I delivered my response. You cannot litigate an asset you have no legal claim to, Richard. I stated, my voice remaining conversational and unhurried. The deed is ironclad. Grandmother ensured it bypassed the estate trust specifically so your lawyers could not touch it. You can threaten me with probate hell all you want, but a judge will throw your filing out before it even reaches a hearing. My clinical dissection of his legal threat acted like a match dropped into a powder keg. The illusion of civilized family negotiation detonated instantly. Preston lunged forward. The heavy mahogany chair scraped violently against the imported rug as he kicked it backward. He braced both hands on the table, leaning his face dangerously close to mine. The polished corporate veneer he wore for his investors vanished completely, replaced by the raw, vicious bully I had known since childhood. Do not lecture us on the law, you arrogant little clerk. Preston spat the words. The veins on his temples pulsed. You think a single piece of paper protects you? I employ senior partners who play golf with federal judges. I can fabricate a lien against that farm by tomorrow morning. I will drown you in so much discovery paperwork, you will spend the next 10 years trying to prove you even own the dirt. He sneered, his eyes raking over my modest attire. And do not think your pathetic little government job offers you any protection. What do you make, Nomi? $60,000? $70,000. I spend that on a weekend ski trip to Aspen. I will make 3 calls and have your department head terminate you for moral turpitude. You will be blacklisted from civil service and bankrupt before the month is over. I felt a sudden, profound detachment. The man screaming at me was my brother, but he sounded like a cartoon villain reciting lines from a cheap legal thriller. He was threatening to use his vast wealth to subvert the federal justice system. He had absolutely no idea that I was the justice system. I am not easily intimidated, Preston. I replied, my tone betraying no emotion. Threatening my employment is a bold strategy, considering you are the one begging me for a lifeline to save your merger. Vivian let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. She pressed her linen napkin to her chest, assuming her favorite role as the wounded matriarch. Begging. She cried, her voice climbing an octave. You think your brother is begging you? He is offering you a chance to finally contribute something meaningful to this family. You have always been so selfish, Nomi. You sit there, clutching your little piece of land, while Preston secures a global dynasty. You are sabotaging his future out of pure, petty jealousy. My mother looked at me with an expression of absolute disgust. It was the same look she gave me when I chose to attend a public university instead of the elite private college she had selected for me. Vivian valued appearances above all else. She measured a person's worth by their zip code, their designer labels, and their proximity to power. My existence was a constant, humiliating reminder that she could not control everything. Jessica seized the opening, eager to reinforce her mother-in-law's cruelty. She crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together in the tense quiet. Look at yourself, Nomi, Jessica mocked, her lips curling into a cruel smile. You come to a billion-dollar celebration wearing sensible leather flats and a blazer that looks like it came from a discount rack. You wear mediocrity like a badge of honor. You do not belong in our world. You never have. We tolerate your presence because Richard is generous, but do not mistake charity for inclusion. I glanced down at my sensible leather flats. They were practical, durable, and designed for long hours traversing the subterranean corridors of federal intelligence bunkers. They were the shoes of a woman who stood on her own 2 feet. I looked back up at Jessica's towering designer stilettos. Her footwear was glamorous, fragile, and entirely dependent on a smooth paved surface to keep her from falling. The metaphor was almost too perfect. "I do not desire inclusion in your world, Jessica," I said quietly. "Your world seems exhausting." Richard slammed his hand onto the table again. His patience had evaporated. "Enough!" he roared. "I am done playing games with you, Nomi. You are acting like a petulant child holding her breath to get attention. We are not negotiating a peace treaty here." He pointed a rigid finger at the blue folder. "We need that farm by midnight. Our foreign partners are demanding the collateral transfer before the Asian markets open. If we do not provide the ghost asset, the capital injection stalls and the merger collapses." I tilted my head, projecting an air of naive confusion. I allowed a small crease to form on my brow. "If this merger is completely legal, why are your partners demanding a ghost asset? Legitimate foreign investors do not require off-the-book transfers to finalize a public corporate merger." Preston laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of any real humor. He thought he was explaining business to a novice. He did not realize he was confessing to a federal investigator. "Legitimate." Preston scoffed, rolling his eyes at Richard. "She wants to talk about legitimate. Grow up, Nomi. The real economy operates in the gray areas. Our partners are navigating complex international sanctions. We have to bypass standard regulatory oversight to facilitate the capital transfer." My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. Preston was handing me the rope. I just needed him to tie the knot. "Bypass regulatory oversight." I echoed, my voice laced with mock skepticism. "That sounds like a euphemism for paying bribes, Preston." Jessica gasped, but Preston simply waved a dismissive hand. His arrogance was a terminal disease. "We do not call them bribes," Preston sneered. "We call them facilitation fees. We have to grease the wheels with certain state actors to ensure the holding trust releases the funds without triggering international banking alarms. It is the cost of doing business at the highest level. You provide the farm, we wash the fees through the property title, and the merger closes. Everyone wins." The air in the dining room turned instantly frigid. He said it out loud. "State actors. International banking alarms. Washing the fees." Preston had just casually admitted to violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. He had confessed to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And by explicitly mentioning the circumvention of international sanctions, he had potentially admitted to violating the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. They were not just a family of greedy corporate raiders. They were actively conspiring to launder money for sanctioned foreign operatives. They were criminals. I looked at the four people sitting around the mahogany table. They were staring at me, expecting my resistance to crumble under the weight of their combined psychological assault. They thought they had cornered me in a hostile room. They believed I was completely outnumbered and powerless. They were wrong. I was not trapped in the room with them. They were trapped in the room with me. I slowly lowered my left hand beneath the edge of the dining table. My fingertips brushed against the cold metal casing of the specialized smartwatch strapped to my wrist. It was not a commercially available fitness tracker. It was a piece of encrypted hardware issued by the Treasury Department. I found the small, tactile button located flush against the side casing. I pressed it twice. A microscopic haptic vibration pulsed against my skin, confirming the command. The device instantly activated a military-grade audio recording application. It bypassed all local commercial networks, opening a silent, encrypted uplink directly to a secure federal server in Northern Virginia. Every threat Preston had screamed, every admission of facilitation fees, every cruel insult Vivian and Jessica had hurled. It was all being digitized, archived, and categorized as federal evidence in real time. I looked back up at Richard. The hidden microphone was live. It was time to let him finish digging his own grave. "I am not going to help you launder money for sanctioned state actors, Richard." I stated, my voice clear and unwavering, ensuring the recording picked up every syllable. "I will not sign that deed." Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The paternal facade shattered completely, revealing the monster underneath. He pushed his chair back and stood up his towering frame, casting a long, dark shadow across the dining table. He marched toward a vintage wall safe located near the far corner of the room. The conflict was about to shift from a barrage of threats into a calculated act of psychological warfare. The heavy steel dial of the vintage wall safe clicked in the silent dining room. Richard turned the brass knob with practiced precision. The thick metal door groaned open, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. I kept my left arm resting naturally on my lap. The microscopic vibration against my wrist assured me the encrypted uplink remained open. My Treasury Department server in Virginia was actively archiving every threat, every admission, and every breath taken in that room. Richard walked back to the head of the table. He did not sit. He tossed a stack of thick, cream-colored envelopes onto the mahogany surface. The ambient light from the crystal chandelier caught the gleaming gold foil embossed on the paper. The presidential seal pressed into the wax gleamed like a newly minted coin. He looked down at me. The pulsing veins in his neck had settled, but his eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "You have until midnight to put your name on that deed, Nomi." He spoke with the cold finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "If the clock strikes 12 and I do not have that collateral, you are no longer a Wallace. You will be excised from the estate trust. You will be banned from every property I own. I will erase your existence from this bloodline. You will walk out of those front doors tonight, and you will never return." Erased. Disowned. For a normal daughter, those words would strike like a physical blow. They would trigger a desperate scramble for approval. My mother Vivian watched my face, hungrily waiting for my lower lip to tremble. She wanted the tears. She craved the validation of my heartbreak. I denied her the satisfaction. I analyzed my father's threat through the lens of a federal prosecutor. He was establishing a clear timeline for his extortion. Midnight. Richard arranged the envelopes in a neat row next to his wine glass. 4 tickets, he announced, tapping the heavy cardstock. "Do you know what these are?" I kept my face blank, though I knew the answer. I had personally reviewed the security clearance manifest for this specific event 3 days prior. "These are VIP passes to the White House State Dinner next week," he boasted, "a celebration of international financial partnerships. The president will be in attendance. The Secretary of State will be seated 2 tables away. My firm secured primary seating because we are bringing $1 billion of foreign capital into the domestic market. We are going to be crowned the kings of global finance while the entire Washington press corps watches." He reached into his breast pocket and produced one more envelope. A 5th ticket. He held it up, letting it catch the light. "I pulled strings, Nomi. I cashed in substantial political capital to acquire this extra seat. I intended to bring you. I wanted to drag you out of your depressing civil service life and let you experience real power for a single evening. I was willing to buy you a proper gown and let you pretend you belonged at the apex of society." Richard let the silence hang, allowing his cruel intention to saturate the room. He wanted me to mourn the loss of an invitation. "But you have proven yourself unworthy of the privilege." He lowered the envelope and slid it across the table toward his daughter-in-law. "Jessica, call your mother tonight. Tell her to secure a designer dress. She will take the 5th seat at our table." Jessica gasped, pressing her manicured hands to her cheeks in a theatrical display of delight. "Oh, Richard," she gushed, "my mother will be thrilled. She actually understands the gravity of an event like this. She knows how to converse with diplomats and cabinet members." Vivian nodded, taking a slow sip of her wine. "It really is for the best, Richard." She sighed, casting a dismissive glance in my direction. "Let us be honest. Nomi would only embarrass Preston in front of the foreign dignitaries. Look at her posture. Look at her clothes. She carries herself like a woman who fetches coffee. If the defense contractors saw her sitting at our table, they would question the credibility of the entire merger. Jessica's mother has the pedigree required to navigate the West Wing. Nomi lacks the fundamental class for that environment. They were trying to break my spirit by excluding me from a party. They believe stripping away a piece of gold-embossed paper was the ultimate punishment. The staggering magnitude of their delusion washed over me. They were weaponizing an invitation to an event where I was effectively the guest of honor. They were bragging about brushing shoulders with cabinet members who reported directly to my division. They planned to finalize a money laundering operation inside the White House under the noses of the federal government. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The quiet click of a trap falling perfectly into place resonated in my mind. They had handed me the motive, the timeline, and the location for their own destruction. They were going to walk into a federal stronghold wearing tuxedos and expecting a coronation. I stood up. The wooden legs of my chair scraped softly against the imported rug. I reached down and buttoned the center button of my gray blazer. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a tearful plea. I looked at the 4 people sitting around the mahogany table. "Keep the ticket, Richard," I said. My voice carried a calm, level resonance that caused his triumphant smirk to falter for a fraction of a second. "You are going to need all the support you can muster next week." I turned my back on them. I walked out of the dining room, my sensible leather flats moving with measured, purposeful steps against the marble floor of the hallway. I left the blue folder sitting untouched next to Preston's spilled wine. Behind me, I heard Jessica excitedly dialing her phone to share the news about the White House. I heard my father pour another glass of scotch, celebrating his perceived victory. They thought they had won. They thought they had banished a useless clerk into the cold night, leaving their criminal enterprise secure. They had no idea they had just armed a federal intelligence director with a loaded weapon. I stepped into the dim light of the grand foyer. My wool coat hung in the hall closet, but my eyes were drawn to a different target. Resting unattended on a custom mahogany credenza was Preston's silver work laptop. The screen glowed softly in the shadows, displaying his email inbox. He had left his digital vault unguarded. I paused in the quiet foyer, measuring the distance to the machine. I could hear the clinking of glasses from the dining room just down the hall. The game had shifted from a domestic dispute into high-stakes espionage. I reached into the hidden lining of my blazer, and my fingers brushed against a small piece of specialized hardware. It was time to make my first move. The transition from the suffocating heat of the dining room to the chilled quiet of the grand foyer felt like stepping across a geographic border. The ambient noise of clinking crystal and Richard booming a triumphant laugh drifted down the hallway. They were already celebrating. In their minds, they had successfully excised a useless parasite from their pristine family tree. They had issued their ultimatum and watched me retreat. I paused on the edge of the Persian runner. My wool coat hung inside the cedar closet to my left, but my eyes locked onto a different target. Resting on a custom mahogany credenza directly beneath a gilded mirror was Preston's silverwork laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim light, casting a pale rectangular reflection against the polished wood. He had left it open. His email client was awake. Preston was a man who spent millions fortifying his corporate headquarters with biometric scanners and armed guards. Yet inside the walls of his father estate, he believed he was untouchable. He was so insulated by a lifetime of wealth and privilege that he left his digital vault unguarded in the hallway. He assumed the only real threats existed in rival boardrooms or foreign markets. He never considered that the sister he spent his life mocking, the woman wearing sensible leather flats, might be the apex predator in the room. I reached into the hidden inner lining of my gray blazer. My fingertips traced the smooth polymer edge of a microscopic stealth cloning drive. It was a proprietary piece of hardware developed by the engineering division of Treasury Intelligence. Barely larger than a fingernail, it required no passwords and triggered no internal security protocols. It was designed to bypass commercial encryption by mirroring physical memory sectors directly, pulling raw data before the host machine could register the intrusion. The device needed exactly 12 seconds to siphon an entire digital life. 12 seconds to capture the offshore routing tables, the deleted drafts, and the encrypted communication logs. I crossed the foyer, my footsteps silent against the thick woven fibers of the rug. I stepped up to the credenza. The faint hum of the laptop cooling fan reached my ears. I pinched the tiny drive between my thumb and index finger and slid it smoothly into the side port. A microscopic amber LED began to pulse on the edge of the device. 1 second, 2 seconds. The progress bar was invisible on the screen, but I knew the architecture of the malware executing in the background. It was hunting for numerical strings and foreign IP addresses. 3 seconds. The sharp scrape of a heavy wooden chair echoed from the dining room. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached the archway. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. It was Preston. I could hear the distinct sound of ice clinking inside an empty crystal decanter. He was coming to the foyer to retrieve a fresh bottle of scotch from the antique bar cart stationed directly opposite the credenza. The threat of discovery was immediate and lethal. If he walked around the corner and saw me hovering over his machine, the entire federal operation would collapse before it even began. If he spotted the pulsing amber light, he would smash the drive and initiate emergency protocols to scrub his offshore accounts. I could not pull the hardware out prematurely. Severing the connection before the cycle completed would corrupt the payload and leave a fragmented digital footprint on his hard drive. 6 seconds. I had to stall him. I had to blind his situational awareness. I reached into my coat pocket and wrapped my hand around my heavy ring of car keys. I extended my arm over the laptop and let the keys slip from my grip. The metal clattered loudly against the wooden surface of the credenza, landing exactly over the exposed port. The bulk of the key fob perfectly shielded the pulsing amber light. 7 seconds. 8 seconds. Preston stepped through the archway, the empty crystal decanter swinging lazily in his right hand. He stopped, his eyes darting toward the sudden noise. His corporate sneer returned the moment he saw me standing near the mirror. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion and lingering hostility. "I thought Richard told you to leave." I turned to face him, positioning my shoulders to block his direct line of sight to the side of the computer. 9 seconds. "I am leaving Preston," I said, keeping my tone flat and unhurried. I dropped my keys. He took a step closer, his gaze drifting downward toward the credenza. The suspicion in his eyes sharpened. I needed to draw his attention back up to my face. I needed to strike a nerve so raw and unprotected that it would override his visual focus. Preston built his empire on perceived invulnerability and physical dominance. He spent thousands of dollars every month cultivating an image of youthful vitality to impress his older foreign investors. His vanity was his most fragile asset. A loss of control over his own image would force a visceral internal panic. I looked directly at the top of his forehead, tilting my head with a look of feigned sisterly pity. 10 seconds. "You might want to ask your international partners for an advance on those facilitation fees," I said, my voice deceptively gentle. "Your hairline is receding much faster than it was at Thanksgiving. The transplant is failing, Preston." His eyes snapped back up to my face. The vanity I was counting on flared hot and bright, overriding his logic. His jaw tightened instantly. He instinctively raised a free hand to brush the front of his styled hair, a micro-expression of deep, paralyzing insecurity. For a fraction of a moment, he was not a ruthless corporate raider securing a billion-dollar merger. He was an aging man terrified of losing his youth. 11 seconds. "You are a bitter, pathetic woman, Nomi," he hissed, lowering his hand quickly to hide the reflexive gesture. "Enjoy the drive back to your miserable apartment. Make sure you clear out your desk by Friday. I am making that phone call first thing in the morning." 12 seconds. The microscopic haptic pulse registered against the skin of my fingers resting near the keyboard. The algorithm was finished. The data was secure. I reached down and scooped up my heavy keyring. In the exact same fluid motion, I pinched the edge of the microscopic drive and slipped it smoothly from the port. It vanished into the palm of my hand before Preston even registered the movement. "I will pack my boxes, Preston," I replied, turning away from him. "Enjoy the White House." He laughed a hollow, victorious sound as he moved past me toward the bar cart. He poured the amber liquid into his decanter, his back turned to the door. I grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door and pulled it open. The crisp Pennsylvania night air hit my face, carrying the scent of damp leaves and cold pavement. I stepped over the threshold and pulled the door shut behind me. The heavy latch clicked into place cleanly, severing the sounds of their celebration and his hollow laughter. I walked down the stone steps toward my unmarked armored sedan, parked near the edge of the circular driveway. The gravel crunched softly beneath my shoes. I slid into the driver's seat, closing the heavy, soundproof door. The cabin was silent and cold. I opened the center console and placed the tiny polymer drive into a secure, synchronized compartment. The dashboard interface flared to life, glowing with a soft green confirmation signal. The payload was locked. I looked up through the windshield at the sprawling, illuminated mansion. Through the sheer curtains of the dining room window, I could see the faint silhouettes of my family raising their glasses in a toast. They were drinking expensive scotch and celebrating their own brilliance. They believed they had successfully intimidated a minor obstacle out of their path. They thought they had secured their financial dynasty for the next century. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to their kingdom to the architect of their demise. The drive resting in my console held every lie, every bribe, and every shadow ledger they had ever created. What horrific secrets were hiding in the fragmented files of Preston hard drive? The tires of my unmarked sedan gripped the asphalt as I merged onto the Pennsylvania Turnpike heading south toward Virginia. The rhythmic hum of the road provided a steady soundtrack to the shifting landscape. Behind me, the opulent estates and manicured lawns of my childhood faded into the dark. I watched the glow of the city recede in the rearview mirror. For decades, I carried the weight of my family and their endless disappointment. Every dinner was a trial. Every holiday was an exercise in measuring my perceived inadequacies against my brother and his corporate triumphs. I tolerated the subtle jabs and the overt cruelty because a naive fraction of my heart still believed blood carried an inherent obligation. I endured their vanity, hoping to eventually earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. That burden evaporated somewhere between the driveway and the highway on-ramp. The emotional tether snapped, leaving a clean, surgical disconnect. I felt lighter. The woman who walked into that dining room was a dutiful daughter clinging to an illusion. The woman driving away was an apex predator returning to her natural habitat. My family spent their lives curating an image of supreme authority. They bought influence. They intimidated rivals. They believed true power was loud and dressed in bespoke Italian wool. They were blind to the reality that genuine, unyielding authority does not need to announce itself at country clubs. True power operates in the quiet, windowless rooms they never even knew existed. I am not a mid-level accountant. I do not push paper or file mundane tax returns for the government. I serve as the director of a special access program buried deep within the architecture of Treasury intelligence. My division operates black book protocols. We track cartel logistics. We dismantle terrorist funding networks. We monitor the invisible, subterranean pipelines of global finance that dictate the rise and fall of sovereign nations. I possess unilateral jurisdiction over domestic financial security. If a transaction threatens the economic stability of the United States, I do not need a judge to issue a warrant. I do not need a panel of politicians to debate the optics. I require only a single keystroke to freeze bank accounts, seize corporate assets, and halt international mergers before the ink dries. My signature is a death sentence for illicit capital. I reached toward the center console. The encrypted drive rested securely in the synchronization cradle. System interface online, I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. The dashboard screen shifted from the standard navigation map to a stark, minimalist command terminal. A soft blue light bathed the leather interior of the cabin. A synthesized voice responded through the encrypted audio channels built into the vehicle's speakers. Voice recognition verified. Welcome, Director, the AI intoned. State your parameters. Initiate a Level 4 forensic decryption on the imported payload. I instructed, keeping my eyes on the dark stretch of highway unfolding in the headlights. Cross-reference all numerical strings with the Active Threat Detection Database. Look for offshore routing anomalies, shell company registries, and sanctioned foreign entities. Processing, the AI replied. The blue light pulsed rhythmically. I settled back into the driver's seat, adjusting the steering wheel. The heater blew warm air across my hands, warding off the November chill. I thought about Preston, sitting in his velvet chair, laughing about his temporary international loan. He was a man accustomed to bullying his way through legal loopholes. He relied on high-priced lawyers to bury regulators and paperwork. He assumed the federal government was a slow, lumbering beast that he could easily outmaneuver. He was about to discover that my division did not litigate. We amputated. Director. The AI interrupted the quiet hum of the road. Initial decryption of the primary email client is successful. Analyzing recent correspondence and financial transfer requests. Read the preliminary findings, I ordered. The system has identified multiple flagged transfer attempts originating from the target firm, the AI reported. These attempts correlate with the failed routing numbers you manually restricted at 0800 hours this morning. A cold, calculating smile touched the corners of my mouth. The irony was exquisite. During dinner, Preston had complained bitterly about an annoying federal compliance glitch. He whined about a faceless bureaucrat holding up his billion-dollar foreign capital injection. He cursed the nuisance delaying his triumph. He had no idea that the glitch was not an automated software error. It was me. While sipping my morning coffee, I had reviewed a suspicious routing request crossing the domestic perimeter. The transaction triggered 3 distinct algorithms designed to catch money laundering protocols. I saw my father and his firm listed as the primary beneficiaries. I did not hesitate. I restricted the transfer and flagged the account for review, placing a silent hold on their international pipeline. Preston sat 5 feet away from me, eating roasted pheasant and threatening to use his political connections to ruin my life. He promised to make phone calls to get me fired. He was boasting about his untouchable status to the exact woman who was actively choking the financial lifeblood out of his empire. The arrogance required to invite the executioner to dinner and then hand her the rope was staggering. They were so distracted by my sensible shoes and my gray blazer, they failed to see the trap closing around them. They equated my modesty with weakness. They handed the entire blueprint of their criminal enterprise to the one individual on the planet equipped to dismantle it piece by piece. They signed their own warrants the moment they threatened to ruin my future over a piece of rural Pennsylvania dirt. The blue pulse on the dashboard quickened, indicating a deeper penetration into the cloned hard drive. The AI was tearing through Preston commercial-grade firewalls with effortless precision. I watched the progress indicator climb. I expected to find standard white-collar crimes. I expected to uncover routine tax evasion, hidden slush funds, and the usual pathetic attempts to hide wealth from the Internal Revenue Service. I was prepared to draft a comprehensive indictment for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. That alone would carry a 20-year sentence and strip them of their Georgetown estates and their designer wardrobes. But the steady blue light on the console abruptly vanished. The interior of the cabin was instantly bathed in a harsh, glaring amber light. The navigation screen flashed rapidly, replacing the progress bar with a series of warning symbols. A sharp, jarring klaxon sounded through the speakers, cutting through the quiet hum of the highway. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. The relaxed posture I held moments ago vanished, replaced by the rigid alertness of a field operative facing an active threat. My division utilized a strict color-coded classification system for intelligence data. Blue meant standard financial irregularities. Green meant cleared traffic. Red meant a domestic breach. Amber was different. Amber was a classification reserved for a specific tier of intelligence. It indicated the presence of data originating from a sanctioned, hostile state actor. It meant espionage. "Halt decryption," I commanded sharply. "Report system status." The klaxon ceased, but the amber light continued to strobe, casting eerie shadows across my face. Decryption paused. The AI responded. The synthesized voice sounded almost strained under the weight of the restricted protocols. The forensic sequencer has encountered a hidden partition buried within the target root directory. The architecture of the partition utilizes military-grade steganography. It is designed to self-destruct if opened without the proper cryptographic handshake. A hidden partition. Preston did not possess the technical capability to code military-grade steganography. He was a corporate lawyer who bought his way out of problems. Someone else built that vault. Someone with resources far beyond a Pennsylvania hedge fund. What triggered the Amber classification, I asked. My heart beat with a slow, steady cadence. The system has identified the digital signature encapsulating the hidden partition, the AI stated. The signature matches known cryptographic markers utilized by an Eastern European state-sponsored intelligence syndicate. The breath caught in my throat. My family was not just evading taxes. They were not merely greasing the wheels with corrupt politicians to finalize a merger. They were actively communicating with a hostile foreign intelligence network. They were sheltering data engineered by operatives who specialized in destabilizing Western democracies. My father and my brother were colluding with an enemy of the state. The scope of their betrayal was expanding beyond anything I had anticipated. This was no longer a domestic investigation. This was an issue of national security. Prepare a sterile sandbox environment. I ordered, my voice turning into a cold, lethal instrument. Do not trigger the fail-safes. We are going to open that partition. What horrific secrets were hiding in the shadows of Preston hard drive? The armored sedan descended an unmarked access ramp shrouded by heavy timber on the outskirts of Northern Virginia. The location did not appear on any commercial GPS system. The surrounding topography was owned by shell corporations, masking the presence of a federal stronghold. I approached the final security checkpoint. A solid blast door disguised as a reinforced retaining wall blocked the path. I did not roll down the window. I did not present an identification badge. Infrared scanners mapped the structural dimensions of the vehicle, while biometric sensors read my thermal signature through the glass. The steel barrier parted with a deep, mechanical groan, swallowing the sedan into the brightly lit subterranean garage. I parked in a designated bay near a private elevator bank. 2 armed tactical contractors stood at rigid attention. They wore unmarked black uniforms and carried suppressed submachine guns. They were former special operations personnel, vetted and cleared for the highest level of domestic security. They offered a crisp nod as I stepped out of the vehicle. I returned the gesture, moving past them without speaking. The elevator doors opened silently. I stepped inside the stainless steel compartment. There were no buttons to press. A red laser swept across my eyes, scanning the unique ridges of my retinas. A mechanized voice confirmed my clearance level. The carriage plunged deeper into the bedrock. When the doors parted again, I stepped into the nerve center of Treasury intelligence. The command room was a vast expanse of polished concrete and sound-dampening acoustic panels. The air smelled faintly of ozone and chilled electricity. Massive curved monitors spanned the primary wall, tracking global financial streams in real time. The digital rivers of capital flowed across the screens, representing the lifeblood of international commerce. It was a fortress of silent power, a stark contrast to the gaudy crystal chandeliers and velvet chairs my family used to project their influence. Before I could dissect the Amber Alert pulsing on my encrypted drive, I needed to secure the perimeter. I needed to ensure my family remained complacent in Pennsylvania. If they sensed even a fraction of a threat, they possessed the resources to charter a private jet and flee to a non-extradition country before dawn. Richard and Preston were arrogant, but they were not entirely stupid when it came to self-preservation. I had to feed their ego. I had to throw them a piece of bait so irresistible they would willingly stay inside the trap. I pulled my personal cellular phone from my pocket. It was a standard commercial device entirely separate from my secure federal comms. I opened my text messages and selected my father contact name. I stared at the blinking cursor. I channeled the persona they expected. I channeled the defeated daughter, the woman who broke under the weight of their ultimatum. I will send a notary with the signed deed tomorrow morning, I typed. I hit send. The message was a flawless red herring. It conceded defeat. It validated their belief that threats and intimidation were effective tools. By offering the deed, I was providing them the exact collateral they demanded, ensuring they would proceed with their illegal merger. It bought me the necessary 24-hour window to build a federal case that would survive any corporate legal challenge. Less than 30 seconds later, my screen illuminated with a reply. Richard sent a single, smug, thumbs-up emoji. I locked the screen and tossed the commercial phone onto a side table. His complacency was secured. He was likely pouring another glass of scotch, celebrating his total victory over his stubborn daughter. He believed the ghost transaction was safe. I walked to the primary terminal and placed the stealth cloning drive into the main synchronization port. I dropped into the ergonomic leather chair and entered my alphanumeric passcode. The massive curved monitors flared, shifting from global mapping to the isolated data retrieved from Preston laptop. The amber warning klaxon I heard in the car was now a steady, pulsing banner across the top of my screen. The system had successfully quarantined the target data, preventing the hostile architecture from infecting the broader federal network. I initiated a manual override, taking direct control of the forensic analysis. The file in question was not a standard encrypted folder. It was a phantom directory. This type of digital architecture was designed to exist in the negative space of a hard drive, entirely invisible to commercial operating systems. If a standard user attempted to access the directory without the exact cryptographic sequence, the files would instantly overwrite themselves with useless binary garbage, destroying the evidence. Preston did not build this. He lacked the technical sophistication. He was merely the courier carrying a locked briefcase he did not know how to open. I pulled up a specialized command line interface. I could not rely on automated algorithms to crack a state-sponsored failsafe. I had to perform the digital equivalent of open heart surgery, using cryptographic scalpels to peel back the defensive layers, one line of code at a time. My fingers moved rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. The rhythmic clacking echoed in the quiet room. I isolated the trigger mechanisms, establishing a false feedback loop to trick the malware into believing the directory was uncompromised. I carefully extracted the encryption keys, parsing the mathematical algorithms. The process required absolute focus. A single miscalculated keystroke would detonate the data. The amber banner flashed, reflecting in my eyes. I felt a bead of sweat trace a line down my spine, despite the crisp temperature of the server room. I executed the final bypass command and pressed the Enter key. The screen froze for a fraction of a second. The pulsing amber light ceased. The command line dissolved, replaced by a stark white window. The phantom directory cracked open. I let out a slow, measured breath. The failsafes were neutralized. The vault was unlocked. The window populated with a massive cache of data. It was not a collection of financial spreadsheets or corporate contracts. It was a repository of dark web communication logs and highly compressed video files. The timestamps indicated the correspondence spanned several months. I highlighted the communication logs, isolating the routing histories. The messages were routed through heavily encrypted proxies, bouncing from servers in Cyprus to proxy farms in Macau, before settling into the Eastern European syndicate. The dialogue was heavily coded, utilizing financial jargon to mask the true nature of the exchange. They referred to the capital injection as the payload, and the foreign investors as the architects. I needed explicit confirmation. I needed the undeniable smoking gun that linked my family directly to the syndicate. I clicked on the first compressed video file in the cache. The media player initialized, buffering the high-definition footage. The screen went black for a moment before rendering the image. What devastating truth was captured on that hidden recording? The media player rendered the compressed video with startling clarity. The footage was dated 3 months prior, bearing a timestamp that placed it long before the current merger negotiations became public knowledge. The setting was not a corporate boardroom in Philadelphia. It was a sprawling, ultra-luxury hotel suite overlooking the neon-soaked skyline of Macau. The camera angle suggested a hidden recording device, likely placed there by the foreign operatives to maintain leverage over their American partners. My father Richard and my brother Preston sat on a plush leather sofa. Across from them, positioned around a low glass table, sat three men in immaculate tailored suits. The foreign operatives lacked the loud, desperate posturing of my family. They sat perfectly still, exuding the quiet, lethal confidence of men accustomed to dealing in state secrets. I engaged the audio enhancement filters, clearing the ambient hum of the suite air conditioning. Richard leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He adopted his most charming, predatory smile, the smile he used to charm country club donors and intimidate junior partners. The domestic regulatory hurdles are substantial. Richard stated, his voice smooth and confident. The United States Treasury is notoriously aggressive regarding foreign capital injections into critical infrastructure. If we simply accept $1 billion from your holding trust, the federal oversight committees will freeze the assets within 48 hours. The lead operative, a man with slate gray eyes and a sharp jawline, did not return the smile. "We are aware of the regulatory climate, Mr. Wallace," he replied, his English flawless and completely devoid of an accent. "That is precisely why we engaged your firm. You assured us you possess the necessary avenues to bypass that oversight. If you cannot provide a secure pipeline, the capital remains in our accounts and the partnership dissolves." Preston scoffed, adjusting his silk tie. He looked at the foreign agents with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed his wealth made him invincible. "You do not need to worry about the oversight," Preston boasted. "My legal team has engineered a flawless ghost transaction. We utilize pristine, unencumbered real estate as untraceable collateral. We wash the facilitation fees through a domestic title transfer, completely masking the origin of the capital." The slate-eyed operative tilted his head slightly. "The collateral is a minor detail." He countered, "The primary objective is the integration phase. We are providing a $1 billion injection to finalize your acquisition of the regional energy grid. In exchange, we require unfettered administrative access to the grid control software. You promised us the back doors." My breath stalled in my lungs. The temperature in the server room felt suddenly glacial. They were not just laundering money to secure a lucrative corporate merger. They were not merely evading taxes or bribing politicians for favorable zoning permits. Richard and Preston were actively conspiring to hand over administrative access of the United States domestic energy grid to a hostile foreign power. I ran a rapid trace on the IP addresses associated with the dark web communication logs I had parsed earlier. The results populated on a secondary screen, confirming my worst fears. The holding trust in Macau was a known front. The men sitting across from my family were high-ranking operatives for a heavily sanctioned Eastern European oligarchy, an entity explicitly recognized by the Department of Defense as a hostile state actor specializing in cyber warfare and critical infrastructure sabotage. My family was trading the security of the American electrical grid for a $1 billion payout. If those backdoors went live, the foreign syndicate could theoretically plunge entire swaths of the eastern seaboard into darkness. They could extort the federal government, paralyze emergency response systems, and destabilize the national economy with a single command. It was a direct, catastrophic violation of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It was a betrayal of staggering proportions. Preston leaned closer to the glass table, pointing a finger at the lead operative to emphasize his point. "You will get your access," he promised. "The software integration is already coded into the merger framework. The moment the capital clears the holding trust, the back doors activate. You will have full administrative oversight, masked as routine diagnostic protocols." I pulled up the routing logs retrieved from Preston's laptop. I cross-referenced the digital signatures attached to the modified software integration files. The cryptographic hash matched Preston's private key perfectly. He had personally authorized the transfer of the corrupted code. He had left his digital fingerprints on the weapon that would compromise the nation. He was the middleman facilitating the treason. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They were willing to risk the lives and safety of millions of citizens just so Jessica could buy more diamonds and Richard could boast about his net worth at dinner parties. They viewed the country as a piggy bank to be smashed open and looted. The video continued to play. The foreign operative did not look entirely convinced by Preston's arrogant assurances. The technical integration is only one half of the equation. The operative stated, steepling his fingers. The Treasury Department utilizes aggressive threat detection algorithms. Even if you wash the capital through real estate, the sudden acquisition of an energy grid by your firm will trigger a federal audit. How do you propose to navigate a direct investigation by the authorities? If they uncover the source of the capital, we lose the back doors, and you spend the rest of your lives in a federal penitentiary. Richard waved a dismissive hand, brushing away the threat of federal prison, as if it were a minor inconvenience. He let out a dark, condescending chuckle. "You underestimate my resources," Richard said, leaning back into the leather sofa. "We have engineered a flawless contingency plan. We do not need to fight a federal audit. We simply need to provide them with a convincing scapegoat." My pulse quickened. The detached, clinical focus I maintained began to fracture entirely. A cold knot of absolute dread formed in my stomach. A scapegoat. The operative repeated, raising a single skeptical eyebrow. "The federal authorities do not accept minor sacrificial lambs when investigating billion-dollar infrastructure breaches. They will demand a target with credible access and motive." Preston grinned, a wicked, satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He looked at his father before turning back to the operatives. "We are not offering them a minor lamb," Preston stated, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. "We are offering them a federal employee, my sister, Nomi." The air in my command center seemed to evaporate. I stared at the high-definition image of my brother, casually offering my life to hostile foreign agents. "She is a clueless, low-level clerk working for the government," Preston continued, completely oblivious to the reality of my position. "She possesses a clean civil service record and a mid-level security clearance. We are forcing her to sign over the real estate collateral tomorrow. Once her name is tied to the ghost transaction, she becomes the primary domestic anchor for the illicit funds." Richard nodded, taking a slow sip from a crystal tumbler. "If the Department of Justice launches an inquiry, we have already fabricated a digital trail pointing directly to her," Richard explained. "We cloned her network authorization credentials months ago. We will frame her as the mastermind. We will claim she utilized her government access to facilitate the money laundering operation without our knowledge." My father took another sip of his drink, his eyes cold and dead. "We take the $1 billion. The foreign investors gain grid access, and when the feds come knocking, my daughter takes the fall. She spends the rest of her life in a federal black site, and the trail goes completely cold." The video kept playing, but the sound faded into a dull, roaring rush in my ears. The magnitude of their betrayal defied human comprehension. They were not just mocking my wardrobe or belittling my career choices. They were actively plotting to frame me for high treason. They planned to sacrifice my freedom, my reputation, and my life to protect their criminal empire. They were marking their own blood for a federal execution. The icy calm I relied on to navigate global crises shattered. It was instantly replaced by a burning, unyielding, diamond-hard rage. What was the next layer of this horrific plot, and how deep did the betrayal truly run? The high-definition footage from the Macau hotel suite continued to play. The faces of my father and brother filled the massive curved monitors in my command center. They looked incredibly pleased with themselves. They believed they had engineered the perfect crime. They believed they had constructed a foolproof labyrinth of offshore accounts and political bribes shielded by the ultimate sacrificial lamb. I sat in the ergonomic leather chair, staring at the screen. The initial shock, the visceral human reaction to hearing your own family plot your destruction, gave way to something far colder and infinitely more dangerous. Preston reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He pulled out a small, rectangular object and tossed it casually onto the low glass table, separating them from the foreign operatives. The object landed with a soft, plastic clatter. The camera zoomed in, automatically focusing on the item. It was a standard-issue United States Treasury Department identification badge. My identification badge. I leaned forward, bracing my hands against the edge of the console. The timeline crystallized in my mind. 4 months ago, during a rare mandatory family holiday dinner at the Pennsylvania estate, I had misplaced my primary clearance badge. I tore my apartment apart searching for it. I ultimately reported it lost, forcing my division to issue a replacement and execute a tedious security audit of my physical access logs. I had assumed it slipped out of my coat pocket. I never imagined my own brother lifted it while I was helping Vivian clear the dining room table. We extracted the embedded RFID chip and cloned the magnetic strip. Preston explained, pointing at the stolen badge. We secured her digital signature utilizing a highly sophisticated keylogger we covertly installed on her personal laptop during a family visit. We possess her complete network authorization parameters. The slate-eyed operative picked up the badge, turning it over in his hand. He examined my photograph printed on the front. He looked unimpressed. A mid-level clearance badge offers limited utility. The operative stated, tossing the plastic card back onto the glass table. It might allow her to bypass standard commercial audits, but it will not grant access to the critical infrastructure firewalls required to mask the grid integration. You need administrative overrides to authorize the ghost transaction. Richard let out a dark, patronizing chuckle. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. You are applying conventional logic to an unconventional problem, Richard countered. The beauty of the strategy lies in her perceived insignificance. Nomi is a nobody. She is a low-level clerk who pushes paper and obeys orders. When the federal investigators trace the corrupted code back to her digital signature, they will not look for an administrative override. They will assume she was a useful idiot manipulated by the true architects. He took a slow sip of his drink. The investigators will assume she left her terminal unlocked or carelessly shared her credentials. They will conclude she was negligent, not malicious. The Department of Justice will crucify her for gross incompetence to secure a rapid conviction. They will throw her in a federal black site to bury the embarrassment, and the investigation will close. The trail stops with my daughter. The magnitude of their miscalculation was staggering. They had stolen an identification badge, believing it belonged to a low-level clerk. They had cloned an RFID chip, assuming it granted access to mundane tax records and standard compliance forms. They had absolutely no idea they had stolen a Level 9 clearance key. They possessed the digital signature of the director of a special access program. That single cloned chip did not just bypass standard commercial audits. It possessed the unilateral authority to trigger national security protocols, initiate global asset freezes, and flag unauthorized access attempts directly to my isolated servers. By attempting to frame a clerk, they had inadvertently linked their entire treasonous operation to the highest tier of Treasury intelligence. They had essentially handed a loaded weapon to an apex predator and invited her to pull the trigger. The lead operative leaned back into the plush leather sofa, steepling his fingers. He remained unconvinced by Richard's arrogant assurances. The foreign syndicate operated on paranoia and lethal pragmatism. They did not trust corporate lawyers to handle domestic espionage. The framing strategy is plausible. The operative conceded, his tone devoid of any warmth. However, it introduces an unacceptable variable. If your daughter discovers the manipulation before the capital clears, she could alert the authorities and compromise the integration. We require an insurance policy to guarantee her compliance and ensure our investment remains secure. Preston waved a dismissive hand. Nomi is a coward, he sneered. She is terrified of Richard. We demanded her grandmother farm tonight as the initial collateral. Once she signs the deed, she is legally implicated in the transfer. She will not risk her own prosecution to expose us. The operative shook his head slowly. A deed transfer is insufficient leverage for an operation of this magnitude, he stated. We demand tangible collateral. We need the ability to compel her silence directly if she proves uncooperative. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a sleek, encrypted smartphone. He placed it on the table next to my stolen badge. Provide us with her primary residential address, the operative commanded. Provide us with her daily schedule, her commuting routes, and the security parameters of her apartment building. If the ghost transaction encounters any unforeseen friction, we will dispatch a specialized containment team to secure her physically. My blood ran cold. The temperature in the subterranean command center seemed to plummet. A containment team. It was sanitized intelligence jargon for a sanctioned hit squad. The foreign operatives were demanding my home address to pre-position a team of assassins. They wanted the ability to execute me immediately if their billion-dollar grid integration faced any resistance. I watched the massive curved monitor waiting for my father to object. I waited for a flicker of hesitation, a momentary pause born from basic human instinct. He was a ruthless corporate raider, but surely he would not casually hand over his daughter home address to a hostile state assassination team. Richard did not hesitate. He did not blink. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a silver pen. He leaned over the glass table and scrawled a series of letters and numbers onto a luxury hotel napkin. He slid the napkin across the table. She lives in a secured high-rise in Northern Virginia. Richard stated, his voice flat and clinical. The building utilizes a standard electronic key fob system, but the service entrance in the rear alleyway lacks camera coverage. She generally returns from her office at 1800 hours. She lives entirely alone. The operative picked up the napkin, examining the address. He nodded, passing the information to the silent men flanking him. The collateral is accepted, he declared. The integration proceeds as planned. The video feed terminated abruptly, returning my monitors to the stark white window of the phantom directory. I sat in the silence of the bunker. The rhythmic hum of the massive cooling fans sounded like a ticking clock. My family had marked me for death. They had explicitly bartered my life to secure a billion-dollar payout. They provided hostile foreign agents with the exact logistical blueprint required to murder me in my own home. They did it without a second thought, without a single trace of remorse. The stakes had skyrocketed past financial crimes and corporate greed. This was no longer a case of domestic wire fraud. It was a matter of lethal, life-and-death treason. My father and my brother were active accomplices in an assassination plot directed against a federal intelligence director. The conflict had evolved. I was no longer an investigator building a white-collar indictment. I was a targeted operative fighting a war of survival against a state-sponsored syndicate and my own bloodline. I reached across the console and disabled the automated containment protocols on the Phantom directory. I needed every piece of raw data unredacted and unfiltered. I compiled the Macau video, the stolen security clearance logs, and the dark web communication routing tables into a single encrypted execution package. I stared at the blinking cursor on the command line interface. The apex predator had been targeted. The trap my family thought they had set was about to become their tomb. How would I orchestrate a counterstrike devastating enough to annihilate their entire empire before the foreign containment team reached my door? The silence in the subterranean bunker was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the server racks processing the execution package. The revelation that my family had provided my home address to a foreign assassination team severed any lingering connection I held to the Wallace name. The icy calm I relied on to navigate the labyrinth of international finance hardened into diamond. I was no longer dealing with arrogant corporate raiders. I was dealing with domestic terrorists. I reached across the console and flipped the heavy toggle switch, engaging the secure communication matrix. The standard monitors faded, replaced by a specialized encrypted video conferencing interface. I bypassed the standard interagency protocols and initiated a Priority 1 tactical link directly to the Pentagon Situation Room and the Secure Command Center at the Department of Justice. The screen split into two high-definition feeds. On the left, Admiral Harrison appeared sitting rigid at a massive oak conference table. The 4 stars on his uniform gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the Pentagon. On the right, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation leaned forward, his face drawn and intensely focused. Both men had been briefed on the initial routing anomalies earlier that morning. They expected a routine update on a blocked domestic capital transfer. They were entirely unprepared for the payload I was about to deliver. Director Wallace. Admiral Harrison spoke, his voice carrying a deep, gravelly resonance. We received the Amber Alert notification originating from your sector. Has the hostile intrusion escalated? It is not an intrusion, Admiral, I replied, keeping my tone flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. It is a welcomed integration. I pressed a single key, transmitting the encrypted execution package to their localized terminals. I bypassed the preliminary summaries and opened the feed directly to the Macau Hotel Suite video. The two most powerful men in federal law enforcement and military security watched the footage in absolute stunned silence. They watched my father and my brother casually negotiate the surrender of the United States domestic energy grid to a sanctioned Eastern European oligarchy. They listened as Preston promised administrative backdoors and explicitly detailed his plan to forge a federal signature to mask the breach. When the video reached the moment, Richard scrawled my home address onto a napkin, offering my life as collateral to a foreign hit squad. The FBI director slammed his fist onto his desk. The sudden, violent impact echoed through the secure audio channel. This is high treason. The FBI director roared, his face turning a dark, mottled red. He pushed his chair back, standing up abruptly. The Wallace firm is actively conspiring to sabotage critical national infrastructure. I am dispatching a hostage rescue team to their Pennsylvania estate right now. We will breach the perimeter, secure the hostiles, and rip that mansion apart down to the foundation. Negative. I commanded, my voice slicing through his anger with clinical precision. You will stand down your tactical teams, Director. The FBI director glared at the screen, clearly unaccustomed to having his operational authority challenged during an active national security crisis. They have provided a hostile state actor with a logistical blueprint to assassinate a federal intelligence director, he argued, his voice rising. They are sitting in a Pennsylvania suburb holding the keys to the Eastern Seaboard power grid. We cannot afford to wait. We raid the compound tonight. A pre-dawn raid on a private estate allows them to control the narrative. I countered, maintaining my diamond-hard composure. Richard employs a legion of aggressive corporate litigators. If you kick his door down in the dark, his lawyers will claim it is federal overreach. They will spin the Macau video as a fabricated deep fake generated by a disgruntled daughter. They will tie the Department of Justice up in endless procedural hearings, while the foreign syndicate quietly scrubs their digital footprint and vanishes. I leaned closer to the camera, ensuring they felt the full weight of my strategic assessment. We do not raid them in the dark, I stated. We execute them in the light. We drag their treason out into the open, where no amount of money or political influence can save them. We demand a public, undeniable annihilation of their empire. Admiral Harrison steepled his fingers, studying my face through the video feed. He recognized the tactical advantage of a public exposure. He understood that neutralizing a threat was only half the battle. Destroying the ideology behind the threat required a spectacle. What is your proposed theater of operations, Director Wallace? The Admiral asked, his tone shifting from outrage to calculated military strategy. The White House State Dinner next week, I replied. The FBI director slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his brow furrowing in deep skepticism. The State Dinner, he repeated, running a hand over his face. You want to orchestrate a federal takedown of $1 billion corporate syndicate inside the most heavily monitored diplomatic event of the year. Exactly, I confirmed. Richard secured 4 gold-embossed VIP tickets to the gala. He intends to use the event as a victory lap. He believes the president will publicly acknowledge his firm for bringing foreign capital into the domestic market. He is walking into that ballroom expecting a coronation. We are going to give him an execution. I brought up the digital seating chart for the state dinner, projecting the schematic onto their screens. I highlighted the primary VIP table, located directly adjacent to the main podium. They requested primary seating. I explained, We give it to them, but we control the environment. I need you to coordinate with the Secret Service Detail Commander. We are going to replace the foreign diplomats and defense contractors assigned to their table with undercover federal agents. We surround them completely before the first course is even served. The logistical complexity of executing a raid inside the White House without triggering a diplomatic crisis is staggering. The FBI director cautioned, "We have dozens of allied heads of state attending that dinner. If a tactical breach erupts in the grand ballroom, the Secret Service will immediately initiate emergency lockdown protocols." The optics of armed agents swarming a VIP table could spark an international incident. "There will be no armed breach," I assured him. "There will be no chaotic shootout. It will be a synchronized surgical strike." The undercover agents at the table will maintain their cover until the precise moment of exposure. We allow Richard to experience the absolute pinnacle of Washington power. We let him shake hands with cabinet members and boast to the press corps. We let his arrogance reach critical mass. "And what is the trigger for the takedown?" Admiral Harrison inquired, leaning forward. "I will be delivering the keynote address regarding domestic financial security," I stated. "The White House Chief of Staff has already authorized my presence on the podium. I will stand in front of the entire diplomatic assembly and project the unredacted evidence of their treason onto the massive digital screens flanking the stage. I will publicly veto their billion-dollar merger under the Espionage Act." The room fell silent again as the two men processed the sheer audacity of the plan. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. I was not just planning to arrest my family. I was engineering a scenario that would systematically strip them of their wealth, their status, and their freedom in front of the exact audience they desperately wanted to impress. The Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Division will be on standby. I continued finalizing the operational parameters. The exact second the handcuffs close around their wrists, every bank account offshore holding trust and piece of real estate tied to the Wallace name will be permanently frozen. They will be rendered entirely destitute before they even reach the holding cells. Admiral Harrison offered a grim, slow nod. "The military police will secure the perimeter," he confirmed. "No one leaves the grand ballroom until the hostiles are detained and processed." The FBI director adjusted his tie, his initial skepticism replaced by a cold, ruthless determination. "The tactical teams will be disguised as event staff and sommeliers. We will have them boxed in from every conceivable angle. Director Wallace, your trap is approved. We move on your signal." The video link terminated, returning my monitors to the stark interface of the command line. The federal machinery was officially in motion. The trap was set, and the countdown to the state dinner had begun. Could I orchestrate a massive tactical raid inside the White House without the crushing weight of the confrontation, triggering a fatal misstep? The subterranean bunker hummed with the quiet, relentless energy of a federal operation moving inexorably toward its target. Over the next 5 days, the airspace between my command center and the outside world became a theater of profound dramatic irony. The surveillance protocols I had established on Preston laptop remained active, feeding me a live stream of their daily communications. I possessed an omniscient view of their arrogance, while they remained entirely blind to the guillotine poised directly above their necks. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, Jessica strolled into a high-end luxury boutique in downtown Philadelphia. The audio feed transmitted through her compromised smartphone carried the distinct rustle of expensive silk and the obsequious fawning of a personal shopper. She had brought her mother Beatrice to select the gown she would wear using my stolen VIP ticket. "It has to be flawless," Jessica instructed, her tone dripping with unearned entitlement. "We are sitting at the primary table. The Secretary of State will practically be in our laps. The Wallace firm is finalizing a merger that will rewrite the global financial hierarchy. We need to project absolute dominance. I highly recommend the midnight blue Oscar de la Renta, Madam." The personal shopper suggested, her voice muffled slightly by the ambient music of the boutique. "It is elegant, understated, and photographs beautifully. Jessica let out a sharp, disdainful laugh. Understated is for civil servants and bank tellers. She scoffed. We are not blending in. We are arriving. Bring me the emerald silk with the diamond-encrusted bodice, the one featured in the Milan showcase. I want every woman in that ballroom to know exactly who we are the moment we walk through the doors. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, listening to Jessica casually dismiss the concept of understatement. She viewed wealth as a weapon to be wielded against those she deemed inferior. She was purchasing a $15,000 dress, utilizing a credit card linked to an offshore holding account, currently under federal investigation for treason. I minimized the audio feed interface and opened a heavily encrypted legal database. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking echoing in the cool air of the server room. I was drafting the explicit federal asset forfeiture warrants authorized under the Espionage Act. I typed the exact numerical designation of the credit card Jessica had just swiped at the boutique terminal. I cross-referenced the account with the shell companies managed by Preston. Every single asset purchased with those funds was legally classified as the proceeds of domestic terrorism. Jessica was spinning in front of a three-way mirror, admiring her reflection, while bragging to her mother about how untouchable the Wallace dynasty had become. She had no idea she was staring at a piece of evidence. She had no idea I was actively coding the legal framework that would allow a federal agent to physically strip that dress off her back the moment she stepped out of the White House. The juxtaposition of their staggering vanity against the lethal precision of the federal machinery was deeply satisfying. They were decorating the hull of a sinking ship. Across town in the sprawling corporate headquarters of Wallace Financial, Richard was equally consumed by his own hubris. The surveillance feed captured him dictating an email to his senior public relations director. He was drafting the press release, scheduled for publication the morning after the state dinner. Headline: Richard boomed his voice, echoing slightly in his spacious corner office. Wallace Financial ushers in a new era of global energy security. Subheading: Billion-dollar merger solidifies domestic infrastructure against foreign threats. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his dictation was breathtaking. He was actively plotting to sell backdoors into the domestic energy grid to a hostile foreign intelligence syndicate, and he planned to spin the treason as an act of patriotic fortification. He believed he could manipulate the national narrative just as easily as he manipulated his own family. Make sure you emphasize our deep commitment to the American people, Richard instructed his PR director. The public needs to understand that we are not just a hedge fund. We are the architects of the future. We are untouchable. While Richard polished his self-congratulatory prose, I switched my primary monitor to a secure live feed originating from a classified training facility in Quantico, Virginia. The FBI had constructed a meticulous physical replica of the White House Grand Ballroom. I watched as dozens of highly trained tactical agents executed flawless, synchronized breaches. They wore standard event staff uniforms, moving seamlessly through the mock tables before suddenly pivoting, executing rapid physical takedowns on designated targets. They practiced isolating the VIP table, neutralizing potential threats, and securing the perimeter in under 12 seconds. Richard was practicing his smile in a boardroom mirror while the men tasked with violently ending his freedom practiced driving his face into a pristine linen tablecloth. The clock ticked down relentlessly toward the gala. The tension in my command center tightened like a coiled spring. The federal trap was meticulously constructed, but it relied entirely on Richard maintaining his blinding arrogance. If he sensed even a fraction of the surveillance, if the foreign operatives in Macau detected the forensic decryption of the Phantom Directory, the entire operation would collapse. He was a paranoid man who built his fortune anticipating corporate betrayals. He utilized counter-surveillance sweeps on his office and employed former intelligence contractors to vet his domestic staff. If his paranoia kicked in before he walked through the North Gate, he would abort the merger and scatter his assets across a dozen non-extradition jurisdictions. I constantly monitored the dark web communication logs, scanning for any indication that the syndicate had noticed the breach. The channels remained quiet. The foreign operatives were satisfied with the collateral they received. They believed my home address and the cloned security badge were sufficient leverage to guarantee a smooth integration. The silence was unnerving. In the intelligence community, absolute silence is rarely a sign of peace. It is usually the deep breath taken before a catastrophic explosion. On the final evening before the state dinner, I received an automated alert from the surveillance algorithm tracking Preston's cellular activity. He had initiated an encrypted voice call utilizing a burner application. I routed the audio through the primary speakers, boosting the gain to catch the muffled conversation. "Is the integration ready?" Preston asked, his voice tight with suppressed, nervous energy. The response was heavily distorted, likely routed through a voice modulation filter. "The code is active," the operative replied. "The moment the Capitol clears the holding trust tomorrow evening, the back doors will engage. Ensure your sister remains unaware of the primary signature authentication. If she triggers a manual override before the transfer finalizes, the firewall will lock the system." Preston laughed a short, harsh sound. "Nomi is completely neutralized," he assured the operative. "We have her grandmother deed secured in the safe. She submitted completely. She thinks she bought her way back into our good graces. She will not risk looking at the system architecture. The transfer will be seamless." "Excellent," the operative stated. "Enjoy the dinner, Mr. Wallace. We look forward to a profitable partnership." The line went dead. I sat back in my chair staring at the disconnected signal. Preston had just confirmed the final operational timeline. The logic bomb would activate during the state dinner, precisely when the entire diplomatic corps and the highest levels of the American government were gathered in one room. It was a calculated display of supreme insolence. The pieces were on the board. The players were moving into position. I closed the terminal and stood up, the cool air of the bunker washing over me. I walked to the secure closet at the back of the room and retrieved my tactical evening gown. The heavy silk felt cool against my fingers. The illusion of the Wallace dynasty was about to collide violently with the reality of federal justice. Would Richard manage to maintain his arrogant facade when he realized the daughter he had erased from history was standing at the podium holding his execution order? The stark, bright lights of the secondary screening area illuminated the glass holding pen, turning it into a macabre display case. The timeline had seamlessly merged, returning us to the precipice of the climax at the White House North Gate. I stood on the pristine red carpet, the cool November wind catching the hem of my midnight blue gown. I did not move. I allowed the reality of the power dynamic to settle heavily over the scene. Behind the reinforced glass, the Wallace family was experiencing a catastrophic failure of their perceived reality. They had spent their entire lives operating under the assumption that their wealth made them immune to the indignities suffered by ordinary citizens. They believed rules were merely suggestions for the lower tax brackets. Now they were trapped in a transparent cage normally reserved for individuals flagged on international terror watch lists. Preston slammed his open palms against the thick pane. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his face a mask of purple, furious indignation. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Wallace Financial," he roared, his voice muffled but entirely audible through the heavy glass. "This is an illegal detainment. You cannot hold me here without cause. I have high-powered civil rights attorneys on speed dial. I will sue the Secret Service for unlawful imprisonment. I will drag this entire detail into a congressional hearing by tomorrow morning." The heavily armed agents flanking the holding pen did not even blink. They stared straight ahead, their expressions blank, their posture relaxed, but ready. They were accustomed to dealing with genuine threats to national security, the screaming of an entitled corporate lawyer barely registered as background noise. Vivian stood near the back of the pen, clutching her designer clutch as if it were a life preserver. Her carefully curated matriarchal elegance was dissolving rapidly. She looked around at the press corps gathered near the outer barricades. The journalists were pointing their long lenses directly at the holding pen, capturing high-definition images of the prominent Philadelphia family sweating inside a security checkpoint. "Richard," Vivian hissed, grabbing my father by the arm. "Do something! The paparazzi are taking photographs. This is a complete disaster. We look like common criminals. Make them open the door." Richard was not looking at the press corps. He was not looking at the indifferent agents. He was staring directly through the glass at me. His expression was a chaotic storm of confusion, outrage, and the first cold creeping tendrils of genuine terror. He watched the 4-star admiral standing respectfully at my side. He processed the Secret Service detail commander waiting for my instructions. The daughter he had banished, the woman he had actively conspired to frame for high treason, was commanding the very forces detaining him. It was a cognitive dissonance so profound it temporarily paralyzed him. He mouthed my name, a silent, desperate question pressed against the glass. I did not answer. I turned to the detail commander. "Process their identification thoroughly, Commander," I instructed, my voice carrying a calm, lethal detachment. "Execute a full background diagnostic. Verify their biometrics against the active threat database." The commander offered a crisp nod. "Of course, Director. Should we expedite the clearance given their proximity to the target table?" "Negative," I replied. "I want them subjected to a comprehensive screening. They are not to cross the threshold of the grand ballroom until the appetizer course has been cleared. Let them enjoy the ambiance of the holding pen." "Understood," the commander affirmed, tapping his earpiece to relay the orders to the agents manning the pen. I turned my back on the glass cage, severing eye contact with my father. I did not look over my shoulder as I walked down the long, carpeted corridor leading toward the grand ballroom. The sound of Preston muffled threats and Vivian frantic demands faded entirely, replaced by the soft, elegant strains of a string quartet drifting from the main hall. The physical separation was complete, but the psychological tension was escalating exponentially. I had engineered a delay not out of petty vindictiveness, but out of tactical necessity. By holding them at the gate, I ensured they would enter the ballroom late. They would miss the initial mingling, the casual networking, where they might accidentally stumble upon the true identities of the undercover agents posing as foreign dignitaries. More importantly, I forced them to marinate in their own humiliation. When they finally gained entry, their arrogant composure would be fractured. They would be desperate to reclaim their social standing, eager to overcompensate for the embarrassment at the gate. Their desperation would blind them to the trap waiting at their assigned seats. I approached the massive, heavy oak doors guarding the entrance to the ballroom. 2 Marines in full dress uniform pulled the brass handles, opening the doors in unison. The scene inside was breathtaking. The White House Grand Ballroom was a masterpiece of gilded architecture and historic grandeur. Massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling cast a warm golden light over the sea of dark, tailored tuxedos and vibrant silk evening gowns. The room hummed with the low, sophisticated murmur of the Washington elite. Senators, cabinet members, defense contractors, and allied heads of state mingled, sipping expensive champagne and forging the alliances that dictated global policy. It was the epicenter of American power, and it was entirely under my control. A Secret Service agent stepped forward, offering a discreet nod. He guided me past the standard guest tables, leading me toward the front of the room. We navigated the maze of influential figures, arriving at an elevated primary table positioned directly adjacent to the presidential podium. I took my assigned seat. The name card resting on the crisp white linen did not say Nomi Wallace. It bore my official title, Director of National Cybersecurity and Financial Intelligence. I picked up a crystal water goblet, taking a slow, measured sip. I surveyed the room, viewing the elegant gathering through the lens of a tactical grid. To the untrained eye, the ballroom appeared to be a standard diplomatic gala. To me, it was a highly coordinated federal staging ground. The sommelier, pouring a vintage Bordeaux at the table to my left, was the lead tactical commander for the FBI hostage rescue team. The elegantly dressed foreign dignitary laughing near the massive ice sculpture was an undercover operative for the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Division. The perimeter exits were quietly secured by plainclothes military police. The trap was laid out flawlessly. disguised beneath fine china and polite conversation. I glanced at the vacant table positioned directly below my elevated seating. It was the primary VIP table, the exact location Richard had proudly boasted about securing. The name cards for my family rested on the empty plates. Surrounding their vacant seats were 4 individuals dressed in high-end formal wear. They appeared to be wealthy defense contractors and international financiers. They were, in fact, the elite extraction squad, tasked with executing the physical takedowns when the signal was given. The string quartet transitioned into a sweeping classical piece, signaling the formal beginning of the dinner service. The attendees began to filter toward their assigned tables, taking their seats as the waitstaff distributed the first course. The clock was ticking down. The foreign capital was likely moving through the offshore proxy servers, preparing to hit the domestic holding trust. The hostile backdoors were armed and waiting for the final integration command. 45 minutes passed. The appetizer plates were cleared. The ambient noise of the ballroom settled into a steady, comfortable rhythm. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the room burst open. The entrance was not graceful. It lacked the refined elegance expected at a state dinner. The Wallace family practically stumbled through the threshold, entirely stripping away the dignified facade they had spent millions cultivating. Richard marched inside first. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. The prolonged humiliation inside the glass holding pen had stripped away his polished charm. He looked ragged and intensely furious. Preston followed closely behind him, violently adjusting his tie and glaring at the nearest Secret Service agent, as if he were preparing to file a lawsuit right there in the hallway. Vivian and Jessica entered last. Jessica was furiously trying to smooth out the wrinkled fabric of her $15,000 emerald silk gown. Her mother, Beatrice, trailed behind, looking bewildered and entirely out of her depth. They paused near the entrance, attempting to regain their composure. They surveyed the grand ballroom, taking in the chandeliers, the prominent politicians, and the staggering display of wealth. The momentary awe on their faces was quickly replaced by a desperate, hungry arrogance. They had survived the humiliation at the gate. They had finally arrived at the apex of power. They believed the nightmare was over and the coronation was about to begin. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a federal slaughterhouse. How would the Wallace family attempt to assert their dominance in a room entirely populated by the agents preparing to destroy them? The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the Wallace family, sealing them inside the grand ballroom. The transition from the stark, bright lights of the security holding pen to the warm, gilded glow of the state dinner seemed to trigger an immediate psychological reset. Richard squared his shoulders, inhaling a deep breath of the air-conditioned room. The dark, angry flush on his face receded rapidly, replaced by the familiar mask of supreme, unassailable entitlement. He operated under the delusion that the delay at the gate was a mere administrative blunder, a clerical error perpetrated by overzealous guards who failed to recognize his importance. He was a man who believed his net worth insulated him from genuine consequences. He had spent his career bullying regulators and manipulating markets. The idea that he was actively being hunted by the federal government simply did not compute within the architecture of his ego. Preston mirrored his father's rapid recovery. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, shooting a final disdainful glare at the Marines guarding the entrance. He ran a hand through his hair, checking his reflection in a nearby mirrored pillar. He was ready to conquer the room. "We lost the cocktail hour," Richard muttered, his voice tight with suppressed annoyance as he surveyed the seated guests. "We need to maximize our exposure before the main course. Find our table, Preston. I'm going to locate the chief of staff." The family splintered, moving deeper into the ballroom. Jessica, desperate to reclaim the social standing she felt had been temporarily diminished at the checkpoint, immediately sought out a target for her vanity. She spotted a woman in a stunning, understated silver gown, standing near a towering floral arrangement. The woman held a flute of champagne, projecting an aura of quiet, affluent sophistication. Jessica practically lunged toward her, dragging her bewildered mother Beatrice along. "It is an absolute nightmare navigating the security protocols tonight." Jessica announced, her voice intentionally loud enough to carry over the ambient chatter. She offered a tight, practiced smile. I suppose the administration is overly cautious, given the magnitude of the capital flowing into the domestic market. My husband is finalizing a billion-dollar infrastructure merger this evening. They practically begged us to attend. The woman in the silver gown offered a polite, measured nod. "Is that so?" she murmured, taking a small sip of her champagne. "That sounds like a tremendously complex undertaking." "It is exhausting." Jessica sighed dramatically, touching her diamond necklace. "We are managing international partnerships that most domestic firms cannot even comprehend. We are flying straight to our Aspen estate after the closing signatures to decompress. The regulatory red tape is just so tedious when you are dealing with genuine global wealth." I watched the interaction from my elevated seat, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. Jessica was actively bragging about a treasonous international merger to a complete stranger. She was casually dismissing federal regulations as tedious red tape. She had no idea the sophisticated woman in the silver gown was not a fellow socialite or the wife of a defense contractor. She was the lead field director for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The undercover IRS agent was mentally cataloging every word Jessica spoke. She was matching the description of the diamond necklace and the casual mention of the Aspen estate directly to the asset forfeiture warrants I had drafted in the bunker. Jessica was willingly and enthusiastically verbally confirming her complicity in the money laundering operation to a sworn federal officer. She was talking herself directly into a 10-year prison sentence. While Jessica incriminated herself, Richard was on a mission to secure his political currency. He navigated the crowded floor, ignoring the waitstaff and the lower-tier diplomats. His eyes darted around the room until he locked onto his primary target. The White House Chief of Staff was standing near the central walkway, engaged in a quiet conversation with the ranking senator. Richard did not wait for an introduction. He did not respect the polite boundaries of diplomatic protocol. He bulldozed his way through a group of naval officers, aggressively inserting himself into the conversation. "Mr. Chief of Staff," Richard boomed, his voice engineered to attract the attention of the surrounding press photographers roaming the perimeter. "Richard Wallace, we spoke briefly last month regarding the domestic energy initiatives. I wanted to personally thank the administration for providing the platform to finalize our historic merger tonight. We are bringing $1 billion of secure foreign investment directly into the American infrastructure grid." He thrust his hand forward, presenting a wide, charismatic smile for the flashing cameras. He was attempting to force a public endorsement, attempting to visually link his firm to the highest levels of the executive branch. I tapped the discreet earpiece hidden beneath my hair, opening a direct audio link to the Chief of Staff. "Do not engage the target," I instructed, my voice a cold whisper in his ear. "Hold the line. Let him hang." "Copy." The Chief of Staff murmured almost imperceptibly. He turned his body slightly away from Richard. He did not extend his hand. He did not return the charismatic smile. The Chief of Staff simply stared at my father with an expression of freezing, calculated indifference. The silence stretched. The cameras continued to flash, capturing the excruciating awkwardness of the rejection. The surrounding naval officers stopped talking, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Richard kept his hand suspended in the air. The smile plastered across his face began to fracture. He was accustomed to politicians eagerly accepting his hand and the campaign donations that inevitably followed. He was entirely unequipped to handle a public, unyielding dismissal. He slowly lowered his hand, his face reddening as the humiliation settled in. "I understand you are managing a demanding schedule tonight," Richard said, attempting a rapid, tactical retreat to salvage his dignity. "My family is seated at the primary VIP table near the podium. We look forward to the official announcements. We are ready to initiate the final signatures." The Chief of Staff finally spoke, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. "The official announcements will commence shortly, Mr. Wallace," he stated, his tone carrying a lethal, unmistakable weight. "I strongly suggest you locate your assigned seat. The administration is about to make a very clear, definitive statement regarding the future of our national financial security." Richard nodded eagerly, completely failing to decipher the threat hidden beneath the diplomatic phrasing. He heard the words financial security and assumed the administration was preparing to applaud his merger. His staggering vanity acted as a perfect blindfold. "Absolutely," Richard agreed, turning away. "We are ready." He signaled to Preston and Jessica gathering his flock. They moved toward the front of the ballroom, navigating past the elevated table where I sat, observing the entire theater unfold. They approached the primary VIP table. It was positioned flawlessly, directly in the center of the room, beneath a massive crystal chandelier. It was the most visible location in the grand ballroom. They took their seats. Preston adjusted his suit jacket, shooting a smug look at the men seated at the adjacent tables. Jessica arranged the folds of her emerald gown, ensuring the diamonds caught the light. Richard poured himself a glass of water, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a king returning to his throne. They were surrounded. The distinguished gentleman seated to Preston left was an undercover operative for the Department of Justice. The wealthy defense contractor, chatting politely with Vivian, was a senior agent for the FBI hostage rescue team. The waiter, currently pouring a fresh glass of wine for Richard, carried a suppressed tactical sidearm, holstered beneath his tailored vest. My family was sitting in the exact epicenter of a heavily armed federal strike force. They believed they had conquered Washington. They believed their billion-dollar treason was secure. They were drinking the wine and breathing the air of a cage they had built themselves. I sat at my elevated table, a ghost hovering above the impending wreckage. I took a slow, steady breath, letting the icy calm wash over my nervous system. The logistical maneuvering was complete. The psychological traps had all been sprung. The gentle, sweeping melody of the string quartet abruptly stopped mid-measure. The sudden silence rippled through the massive room, drawing the attention of every diplomat, senator, and operative in attendance. The low murmur of conversation faded into an expectant hush. The White House Chief of Staff stepped up to the main presidential podium. He adjusted the microphone, looking out across the sea of faces. His gaze flicked briefly toward my elevated seat, offering a subtle, confirming nod. The trap was fully armed. The trigger was waiting to be pulled. How would the Wallace family react when the spotlight shifted from their anticipated coronation to the revelation of their absolute destruction? The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, heavy, and expectant. The Chief of Staff stood at the presidential podium, surveying the gathered elite. He gripped the edges of the polished wood, projecting an air of solemn, unyielding authority. "Good evening, distinguished guests," he began, his voice echoing powerfully through the acoustic system. "We gather tonight not merely to celebrate domestic prosperity, but to acknowledge the profound responsibilities required to safeguard our national future. The stability of our republic does not rest solely on military might. It rests on the impenetrable integrity of our financial and domestic infrastructure." Richard nodded sagely, wrapping an arm around the back of Vivian's chair. He leaned over and whispered something to Preston. They were both smiling. They genuinely believed this preamble was the introduction to their victory lap. They assumed the administration was laying the rhetorical groundwork to praise their impending billion-dollar foreign capital injection. "We face unprecedented, sophisticated threats from hostile state actors." The Chief of Staff continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "These adversaries seek to infiltrate our markets, compromise our energy sectors, and purchase leverage through shadow networks. To combat these invisible incursions, the President relies on the absolute authority and unmatched expertise of a specialized intelligence division." The Chief of Staff paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the audience. "Tonight, it is my profound honor to yield this podium to the individual tasked with commanding that division," he announced, his voice ringing with formal respect. "Please welcome the architect of our domestic financial defense, the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence." He turned away from the microphone and stepped back, gesturing toward the elevated table where I sat. A brilliant, stark white spotlight cut through the ambient golden glow of the chandeliers. It tracked my movement as I stood up, the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown catching the light. I stepped out from behind the table and began my descent toward the center stage. The reaction at the primary VIP table, located directly below my path, was a masterpiece of total cognitive collapse. Richard was in the process of raising a crystal goblet of water to his lips. He froze. His eyes locked onto my illuminated figure moving down the carpeted stairs. His brain aggressively rejected the visual data it was receiving. The muscles in his hand went slack. The heavy crystal goblet slipped from his fingers. It plummeted, hitting the edge of the pristine white tablecloth before shattering violently against the floor. Water and jagged shards of glass scattered across his polished leather shoes. He did not flinch. He did not look down. His jaw worked silently, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Preston's reaction was even more visceral. He leaned so far forward, he nearly tipped his chair over. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning bone white. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The arrogant corporate lawyer who had spent his entire adult life belittling my intelligence, threatening my career, and plotting to frame me for high treason, was now watching the White House Chief of Staff bow his head to me in absolute deference. Vivian let out a strangled, horrific gasp. She clutched her chest, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of her expensive gown. She looked from me to Richard and back again, her curated matriarchal world dissolving into ash in a matter of seconds. Jessica dropped her clutch. The designer purse hit the floor, spilling lipstick and a mirror onto the carpet. The haughty socialite who had mocked my sensible shoes and bragged about her $15,000 dress was now shaking uncontrollably. She instinctively shrank back into her seat, attempting to make herself as small as possible as the spotlight washed over their table. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, purposeful cadence of an executioner ascending the scaffold. Every step I took drove another nail into the coffin of their arrogant delusions. I reached the stage and stepped behind the presidential podium. I adjusted the microphone. I looked directly down at my family. We were separated by a mere 15 feet of physical space, but the power dynamic between us spanned an unbridgeable galaxy. I was standing shoulder to shoulder with the executive branch of the United States government. They were sitting at a table completely surrounded by undercover federal agents holding concealed warrants. "Thank you, Chief of Staff," I said, leaning into the microphone. My voice resonated with cold, absolute authority, amplifying through the ballroom and acting like a physical blow against my father. "This is a mistake," Preston whispered frantically, leaning toward Richard, his voice cracking. "This is an insane joke. She is a low-level accountant. She fixes tax forms. Richard, do something." The undercover FBI operative, seated to Preston's left, leaned in slightly, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "You will remain silent, Mr. Wallace," the agent commanded, dropping his disguise completely. "You will show the undersecretary the proper respect, or I will have you physically restrained and removed from this room immediately." Preston swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He sank back into his chair, his corporate bravado pulverized by the threat of immediate physical violence from the man he thought was a fellow diplomat. I let my eyes sweep across the ballroom, taking in the confused faces of the senators, the defense contractors, and the legitimate foreign dignitaries. I needed to translate the complex financial treason into plain, terrifying reality for the audience. Tonight we are gathered to discuss international partnerships and domestic growth, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. But more importantly, we are here to discuss loyalty. We are here to demonstrate the severe, uncompromising consequences for those who choose to betray this republic for personal profit. I reached beneath the podium and retrieved the heavy blue legal folder. It was the exact same folder Richard had tossed across the mahogany dining table 1 week prior, the folder he had used to demand my grandmother farm, the folder he had weaponized in his attempt to force me into his money laundering operation. I held it up, letting the audience see the document. I looked directly at Richard. He was sweating profusely, the collar of his bespoke tuxedo suddenly looking tight and suffocating. I stepped out from behind the podium and walked down the short flight of stairs, stopping directly in front of the primary VIP table. I dropped the blue folder onto the center of the table, right next to Richard's ruined water goblet. The heavy paper slapped against the wood with a loud, definitive crack. "That does not contain the deed to my grandmother farm, Richard." I stated my voice loud enough for the directional microphones to pick up every syllable. "It contains a comprehensive summary of your offshore shadow ledgers." I turned back to the stage and pressed a small tactile button concealed on a handheld remote. The massive 20-foot digital screens flanking the main stage flared to life. They bypassed the standard promotional graphics and illuminated the ballroom with a harsh, sterile blue light. On the left screen, thousands of lines of corrupted routing codes populated the display. On the right screen, the high-definition video from the Macau hotel suite began to play. The audio from the video fed directly into the ballroom speakers. The entire assembly of Washington elite heard Preston boasting about bypassing federal regulations. They heard Richard casually negotiating the surrender of administrative backdoors into the domestic energy grid. They listened in stunned, horrifying silence as my father explicitly offered my home address to foreign operatives as collateral for an assassination plot. A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. The air was sucked out of the room. Senators who had accepted campaign donations from the Wallace firm suddenly looked physically ill. Wives of defense contractors covered their mouths in shock. The string quartet players lowered their instruments, staring at the screens in pure disbelief. "What you are looking at is not corporate maneuvering," I declared, my voice ringing like a steel bell over the murmuring crowd. "It is a deliberate, premeditated act of sabotage." In exchange for $1 billion payout, Richard and Preston Wallace actively conspired to integrate hostile, foreign surveillance software into the critical infrastructure of the United States. Preston jumped to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the plush carpet. "This is fabricated," he screamed, his voice hitting a frantic, hysterical pitch. "She manufactured this data. She hacked my computer to frame us. We are legitimate businessmen." I did not raise my voice to counter his desperate outburst. I simply pressed the remote again. The screen zoomed in on the digital signatures attached to the corrupted source code transfer logs. "That is your personal cryptographic key, Preston," I stated coldly. "It matches your biometric login and your private network credentials. You signed the transfer logs yourself. You left your digital fingerprints on the weapon you plan to use against your own country." Preston collapsed back into his seat as if his legs had been kicked out from under him. He looked at his father for help, but Richard was completely paralyzed. The patriarch of the family, the man who believed he controlled Washington, was staring at the screens, watching his empire burn to ash in real time. I turned away from the terrified faces at the VIP table and addressed the entire ballroom. The time for the final lethal blow had arrived. Under the authority vested in me as the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, I possess unilateral veto power over all domestic financial transactions threatening national security, I announced. I am officially exercising that power tonight. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the terrified crowd. The billion-dollar merger proposed by Wallace Financial is hereby permanently vetoed and terminated, I declared. Richard let out a strangled, horrifying gasp, clutching his chest. He was watching his ultimate triumph evaporate. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. Furthermore, I continued, my voice dropping into an absolute, uncompromising register. This termination is not based on a simple regulatory failure. It is executed under the direct provisions of the Espionage Act. The unredacted evidence displayed behind me proves a coordinated conspiracy to commit high treason against the United States of America. The words high treason hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. It was the ultimate legal hammer, a charge that carried no statute of limitations and offered absolutely no leniency. My family had tried to sell the nation to fund their luxury, and I had just publicly signed their death warrants. The presentation was complete, the veto was official, the trap was ready to spring shut entirely. How violent would the physical extraction be when the undercover agents finally revealed their true purpose? I gave a sharp, definitive nod to the tactical commander stationed near the rear exit. The response was instantaneous. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom flew open, striking the walls with a thunderous crack. The elegant acoustic resonance of the room shattered, replaced by the heavy thud of tactical boots surging across the marble threshold. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark Kevlar vests, emblazoned with the yellow letters of the FBI and the Department of Justice, flooded the space. The undercover operatives seated around the primary table moved in unison, dropping their disguises. The sommelier discarded his winecloth, drawing a suppressed sidearm and flashing his federal badge. The foreign diplomat grabbed a pair of steel restraints from beneath his tailored jacket. The perimeter sealed shut, trapping the prey inside. Richard stood up, his hands raised in a frantic plea for order. He tried to invoke his political connections, shouting about senators and campaign contributions. The lead FBI agent ignored the posturing. He grabbed Richard by the collar of his bespoke tuxedo and drove him downward. Richard hit the table hard, his cheek pressing against the pristine linen. The impact knocked over a decanter, sending a wave of dark red wine cascading across the surface. The liquid saturated the 4 gold-embossed VIP tickets he had flaunted a week prior, turning the symbols of his pride into soggy, ruined pulp. Heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted around his wrists, pinning his arms behind his back. Preston attempted a different tactic. The arrogant lawyer decided to run. He shoved his chair aside and sprinted toward the nearest service exit. He made it 3 steps. 2 military police officers intercepted his path, executing a flawless sweep that sent him crashing onto the plush carpet. The breath rushed from his lungs in a ragged gasp. As the agents secured his wrists, Preston broke. The sneering corporate bully dissolved into a pathetic, weeping shell. He lay on the floor, sobbing loudly, his tears staining the expensive rug as he babbled incoherent promises to cooperate. Jessica witnessed her husband weeping on the floor, and her survival instinct kicked in. She abandoned her mother and bolted toward the corridor, her $15,000 emerald silk gown billowing behind her. She did not account for the physics of panic. Her $1,500 designer stilettos snagged on the thick pile of the carpet. Her ankle twisted, sending her sprawling onto the ground, her diamond necklace scraping against the floorboards. She scrambled to her knees only to find a pair of practical black shoes blocking her path. She looked up into the cold, calculating eyes of the woman in the silver gown, the same woman she had bragged to during the cocktail hour. The undercover IRS agent reached into her clutch and produced a federal warrant displaying it with chilling efficiency. Jessica Wallace. The agent stated, her voice carrying zero pity. I am executing an immediate seizure of all assets associated with your accounts. Your offshore trusts are locked. Your credit lines are terminated. The Aspen estate is under federal control. You possess nothing. Take off the necklace. Jessica let out a piercing wail, clutching her throat as the reality of stark poverty washed over her. Vivian sat frozen in her chair, watching her dynasty evaporate into dust. The matriarch who valued status above her own daughter lacked the strength to even speak. She stared blankly at the chaos her perfectly curated world dismantled in a matter of seconds. The agents hauled Richard up from the wine-soaked table, dragging him toward the center aisle. He stumbled, his polished shoes slipping on the wet floor. With a sudden burst of desperate energy, he twisted his shoulder, breaking free from the agent grip just long enough to lunge toward the stage. He dropped to his knees at the base of my podium. The patriarch of the Wallace Empire was physically prostrating himself at my feet. The agents moved to intercept, but I raised a hand signaling them to halt. I wanted the entire diplomatic assembly to witness the final unraveling of a traitor. Nomi. Richard pleaded, his voice a hoarse, broken rasp. He looked up at me, his face slick with sweat and spilled wine. Please, you have the authority to stop this. We can surrender the capital. We can cancel the merger. You cannot send your own father to a federal penitentiary. Think about our bloodline. Think about family. He weaponized the concept of family, hoping to unearth a remnant of the dutiful daughter he had discarded. He wanted grace from the woman he marked for an assassination squad. I looked down at the weeping man. My expression held zero empathy. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic speech. I simply reached over to my console and cued the audio file extracted from my specialized smartwatch. I pressed play. The ballroom speakers crackled, conveying the crisp, high-fidelity recording of Richard from the dining room exactly 1 week earlier. His own voice echoed through the silent gala. If the clock strikes 12 and I do not have that collateral, you are no longer a Wallace. You will be excised from the estate trust. You will be banned from every property I own. I will erase your existence from this bloodline. The recording stopped. The silence returned heavier than before. I leaned into the microphone. I am just honoring your request, Richard. I stated, my tone clinical and detached. You are erased from the Wallace history. I gave a subtle nod to the waiting agents. They grabbed Richard by the arms, hoisting him upward. He screamed my name, a primal sound of total defeat, as they dragged him backward through the heavy oak doors. Preston followed, hauled away by the military police, his sobs echoing down the corridor until the doors clicked shut. The aftermath of the state dinner unfolded exactly as my intelligence models predicted. The federal justice system moved with swift, uncompromising severity, prosecuting the treason with zero leniency. Preston attempted to negotiate a plea deal, offering to testify against the foreign syndicate. The Department of Justice declined. They already possessed his digital fingerprints on every encrypted transfer log. Faced with undeniable proof, both Richard and Preston were sentenced to life in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. They traded their bespoke tuxedos and private jets for concrete cells and endless isolation. Jessica and Vivian were left to navigate a world they had spent decades mocking. The Asset Forfeiture Division stripped them of their mansions, their jewelry, and their luxury vehicles. They moved into a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Philadelphia, forced to secure minimum wage employment to survive. The socialites who once attended their lavish parties pretended they did not exist, avoiding them entirely on the rare occasions they crossed paths. The poetic justice of the operation extended far beyond prison sentences. The billions of dollars Richard had hoarded in his corrupt hedge fund were seized and repurposed by the Treasury Department. I personally oversaw the reallocation of those assets, channeling the funds into state grants designed to support working-class Pennsylvanians. The very people my family had sneered at, the individuals they deemed unworthy of their elite circles, received the financial foundation to build their own businesses and secure their own futures. The illicit wealth intended to compromise the nation was transformed into the bedrock of local prosperity. 6 months after the gala, I stood on the Truman balcony of the White House. The spring air carried the faint scent of cherry blossoms drifting from the tidal basin. The illuminated monuments of Washington glowed against the dark night sky, projecting a silent, enduring strength. Admiral Harrison stepped through the glass doors, holding 2 crystal flutes. He handed one to me, joining me at the railing. "The final syndicate accounts were frozen this morning, Director," the Admiral murmured, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The domestic grid is secure. You executed a flawless campaign." I lifted the crystal flute, watching the bubbles rise in the pale golden liquid. The emotional weight of my past, the years spent absorbing the cruelty of an arrogant bloodline, had vanished. The toxic roots were pulled from the ground, leaving a pristine, uncorrupted foundation. I took a slow sip of the champagne. The taste was sharp, clean, and undeniably satisfying. It was the quiet, profound flavor of true justice.